Hello, my name is Joel Anderson, and I will be presenting the view that Noah's flood in Genesis 6 through 9 is mythological literature. I'm going to explain it all. If you travel to Williamstown, Kentucky, you are probably going to see right off of I-75 a really big boat, the Ark Encounter, to be precise. The purpose of the Ark Encounter, for all intents and purposes, is to try to convince people that the story of Noah's flood in Genesis 6 through 9 was an actual event in history. That a little more than 4,000 years ago there was a literal global flood that submerged the entire earth underwater. For Ken Ham, the historicity of a literal global flood just over 4,000 years ago isn't just a matter of opinion or an issue of which Christians can have a different view on. For Ken Ham, the very authority of the Bible is at stake. And it's not just the historicity of Noah's flood. Anyone who is familiar with Ken Ham and modern young earth creationism knows that they claim that a literal historical interpretation of Genesis 1 through 11 is foundational to the gospel itself. If the earth wasn't created in 6 days a mere 6,000 years ago, if Adam and Eve weren't the literal first two people in history who lived with dinosaurs, and if there wasn't a global flood 4,000 years ago where Noah saved his family and 2 of every kind of animal on the earth, including dinosaurs, then Christ died for nothing. And if you don't believe that, so says Ken Ham, you are either a godless secular liberal or you are a compromised Christian, and probably liberal. I wanted to start off with that picture of Ken Ham and the young earth creationist movement to draw attention to the fact that more times than not, when it comes to debates like creation evolution, the historicity of Adam and Eve, or in this case, the historicity of Noah's flood, there's a whole mess of deeper issues, assumptions, and presuppositions that color our views and drive our opinions. And oftentimes, especially when it comes to these 3 debates in particular, opinions are drawn and presented along political lines. Liberals and secularists have one view, and conservatives and Christians have the opposite view. Well, that puts me in quite a situation, for I'm neither a liberal nor a secularist. I grew up in a conservative evangelical home, went to a conservative evangelical Christian high school, I've been a Christian my whole life, and never once have I voted for a Democrat. I believe the Bible is the inspired Word of God and completely true. Yet I do not believe the story of Noah's flood, or indeed anything in Genesis 1 through 11, is intended to be understood as trying to convey historical or scientific information. And I've had this view for over the past 20 years. So how does someone like me hold to a view like that? Well, it's simple. It's about context and genre. And the creation evolution debate has nothing to do with it. I came to my conclusion about both Genesis 6 through 9 and Genesis 1 through 11 a whole long time before I ever cared to know anything about the creation evolution debate. I came to that conclusion through solid biblical exegesis and a commitment to understand the original context of Genesis 1 through 11. Genesis 1 through 11 is not addressing modern scientific historical questions. So let's start at the beginning. After all, the best place to begin is in the beginning. The book of Genesis is about beginnings. The beginning of creation, Genesis 1, of humanity, Genesis 2 and 3, and ultimately of civilization itself, that's 4 through 11. Now, many in the modern Western world simply assume that these beginnings in Genesis 1 through 11 are meant to be understood in strict historical terms. Genesis 1 must be given a scientific or quasi-scientific account of exactly how God created the material universe. Genesis 2 and 3 must be a historical account of 2 real people, be it the first 2 literal people or the first 2 hominids bestowed with God's image, who then sinned and screwed it up for everybody else. Genesis 4 through 11 must be a historical account of a pre-flood civilization, a literal global flood, and then eventually of a literal dispersal of the post-flood people at the Tower of Babel. And this is where we as children of the Enlightenment go wrong. Our default position when reading Genesis 1 through 11 is the assumption that it must be doing history and science in one way or another. Consequently, with that assumption, people tend to then go off in one of 2 different directions. When confronted with modern scientific evidence that the universe is 14 billion years old and that there was no global flood 4,000 years ago, people either conclude that modern science is right and the Bible's wrong, and thus end up discounting the truthfulness of the Bible as a whole, or they insist that the Bible's right and that modern science is an atheistic tool to tear down our Christian culture. Well, the problem with both of these views is that they both assume that when God inspired Genesis 1 through 11 back then and there, that he was really addressing the questions that we in the modern world have right here and now. Neither view takes the time to step back and say, wait, Genesis 1 through 11 was originally addressed to people in ancient Israel living in the ancient Near East. How would they have understood it? What was it saying to them? That is why I think that the way Genesis 1 through 11 is often used within the current creation-evolution debate is misguided. The fact is, the ancient Israelites were not 21st century Americans. They were not wrestling with modern scientific questions we wrestle with today. They were an ancient people living in a completely different culture, asking completely different questions about life than we tend to do today. They were living in the ancient Near East, and the ancient Near East was a thoroughly pagan and polytheistic culture. The people at that time were taught that there were many gods, that those gods were petty, violent, and dangerous. They were taught that they themselves were insignificant, slavish peons who were at the mercy of those violent and petty gods. They were told that you had better offer your sacrifices and pay homage to those gods, not because they were good or loving, but because if you didn't, the gods could strike your insignificant life down in a flash. That was the kind of culture that the ancient Israelites were a part of. So we need to be sure we interpret Genesis 1 through 11 in light of that reality. In fact, in light of what happens with the Hebrews' worship of the golden calf at Mount Sinai so shortly after their leaving of Egypt, I think it's safe to assume that for all practical purposes, the ancient Hebrews were effectively pagans themselves. They might have had some memory of the God of Abraham, but they clearly had no qualms about crafting images and idols and bowing down to them, not only at Mount Sinai, but throughout the history of ancient Israel. Therefore, in light of all that, we need to realize that the key to understanding Genesis 1, Genesis 6 through 9, Genesis 1 through 11, or anything in the Bible for that matter, is to try to read it from the perspective of the original audience. We need to ask, what did this mean to them? We need to get into the sandals of the people of ancient Israel and read the Bible from their point of view. For what God inspired, he first and foremost inspired to reveal something to them in their own culture and situation. The fundamental question of genre and the proper understanding of myth. So let's get to the fundamental question that needs to be asked about Genesis 1 through 11 in general, and Genesis 6 through 9 in particular. What are we reading? What is its genre? We can't just assume it is trying to give historical details. If the original intent was not to convey historical information and we interpret it as history anyway, then we are going to be misinterpreting it. Now the answer I'm proposing is that the genre of Genesis 6 through 9, as of Genesis 1 through 11, is that of ancient Near Eastern mythological literature. I don't believe that Genesis 1 through 11 was intended to be understood as a scientific or historical account. In fact, we have a number of ancient Near Eastern texts that scholars have categorized as myth. They are the creation myths found in the Enuma Elish and the Baal cycle, as well as the flood stories found in Atrahasis and the Epic of Gilgamesh. And a lot of stuff in Genesis 1 through 11, specifically the Noah story, looks a lot like the stories in the ancient Near Eastern mythological literature. So we need to come to grips with that. Now obviously some people might freak out a bit and say, what? Are you saying the stuff in Genesis 1 through 11 is like those myths? Those aren't true. Are you saying the Bible isn't true? And that really is a problem, because that term, myth, is a really loaded word. And in many ways it is probably too simplistic and misleading of a term if one doesn't take the time to explain exactly what one means. Personally, whenever I hear someone say something in the Bible is a myth, I cringe, because 9 times out of 10, when someone says, oh, the Bible is a myth, they really mean, The Bible is a bunch of fairy tales, it's superstitious nonsense made up by illiterate Bronze Age farmers. It's weird and stupid, and no one who knows anything about science can believe it is true. So let me be absolutely clear. That is not what I mean when I say Genesis 1 through 11 is ancient Near Eastern mythological literature. When I use the term myth, I'm using it in its proper academic sense as a way to describe the genre of a given piece of writing. Properly understood, myth is nothing more than the category of literature that scholars use to designate the stories of the ancient world that attempted to articulate a culture's worldview beliefs in regard to what they believed about the gods and their relationship to mankind. In that respect, myth is simply a genre category, just like parables, histories, poetry, proverbs, legal material, you name it. In fact, I just finished writing on my blog about the absurdity of the current mythicist movement and people like Richard Carrier, who try to claim that the Gospels are a myth and Jesus never existed. The fundamental problem with Carrier, of course, is that he is obfuscating the accepted academic understanding of myth as a genre of literature by using the term simply as a pejorative. The result is that not only are his claims utterly ridiculous, but they actually make it virtually impossible for people to understand what ancient mythological literature really was and what its purpose was. Therefore, it's really important for us to cut through all that nonsense and to understand just what ancient myth really was. Ancient Near Eastern mythology and the example of Genesis 1. The first thing to realize is that in the ancient Near East there was really no such thing as history writing, because human beings were not seen worthy enough to tell of their history. You simply had myths about the gods and the recorded annals of kings. But the concept of writing history about normal people like nomads, shepherds, prostitutes, slaves, that was just non-existent. At most, the ancient Near Eastern myths were told to solidify and justify the rule of an empire or a ruler who wanted to maintain their power and continue to oppress the majority of what they deemed to be worthless humanity. And this leads us to the second thing to realize about ancient Near Eastern mythology. Ancient Near Eastern myths were decidedly non-historical, for they were about the realms of the gods who existed outside of history. Their purpose was not to convey historical information, but to articulate that given culture's worldview, what they believed about the character of the gods, what they believed about what it meant to be a human, as well as what they believed the ultimate purpose and meaning of life was. Simply put, they used myth to explain their beliefs and their worldviews, not to convey historical information. Let's just take, for example, the difference between Genesis 1 and other ancient Near Eastern creation myths. Now, if you were a pagan in the ancient world and you came across Genesis 1, what things would jump out to you? Well, I'll tell you. You'd realize that what Genesis 1 was saying about God, creation itself, and human beings was something you had never heard before. Side note, ancient Near Eastern cosmology. What made Genesis 1 so revolutionary in the ancient world was not its basic conceptual understanding or cosmology of the universe. That description would have been something that the ancient Hebrews would have been familiar with. The people in the ancient world did not picture the earth as a blue sphere suspended in space. In fact, they didn't even have the same concept of space. How could they? Rather, the extent of their understanding of the universe was based on what they could see with their own eyes, along with some creative and imaginative images that led to their conceptualization of the created order, or rather their cosmology. If you want to get a grasp of how the ancient world viewed things, picture a snow globe placed on one of those fake coral reefs that people often put in their fish tanks, with the snow globe itself actually being underwater, but with the disc inside the snow globe obviously being dry because it's underneath the dome of a snow globe. It's not a perfect illustration, but it does get to the heart of how people in the ancient world, ancient Israel included, understood the created order. Essentially, what it amounted to was this. The earth was a flat disk of land situated on a subterranean mountains or pillars that were deep within the ocean. Somewhere deep down in the ocean was Sheol, the place of the dead. The ocean was also the place where the great sea serpent, whom some cultures viewed as one of the gods, lived. This sea serpent is called Leviathan, and Rahab in the Old Testament was known as Tiamat by other ancient Near Eastern cultures. Above the earth was a solid dome in which were placed all the stars, along with the sun and the moon. Above that dome were the waters above, and above even that was the heavens, the abode of the gods, or, that's if you were pagan, or God, if you were a faithful Israelite. Therefore, the picture the ancient Hebrews would have had in their mind as they read Genesis 1 would not have been the floating blue planet in space that we in the modern world think of. Okay, back to the difference in worldviews. What made Genesis 1 so revolutionary was what it said about God, creation, and human beings. To truly appreciate what Genesis 1 is saying about these things, though, you first have to grasp what the surrounding pagan culture of the ancient Near East was saying about these things. Here's what they believed in a nutshell. Many gods. The ancient Near Eastern cultures obviously taught that there were many gods. They were polytheistic. And these gods were petty, dangerous, and violent. Certainly not good in any sense of morality. Human beings cowered in fear before them, and they certainly didn't love them. Creation. The ancient Near Eastern cultures also taught that the earth was made from the carcass of a defeated loser god. In Mesopotamia, for example, there was a creation myth in which Marduk, a Babylonian god, goes and fights Tiamat, the giant sea serpent god, who was the leader of some of the gods who rose up in rebellion against Marduk. After Marduk defeats Tiamat, he cuts her body in half, puts half of it in the heavens, and forms the earth out of the other half. So if you were a person living in the ancient world, the message was quite clear. Your home was a corpse. Then there was mankind. Not only did the ancient Near Eastern creation myths tell you that you lived on a corpse of a loser god, those same myths told you something about yourself as well. In that very same story where Marduk defeats Tiamat, after he creates the earth with her corpse, he also decides to create human beings. What he does, though, is he first takes Kingu, the god who instigated the rebellion in the first place, and he cuts Kingu's arteries and kills him. Marduk then creates human beings out of Kingu's blood, and they are considered to be savages whose sole purpose was to slavishly work for the gods. And there are other myths that have human beings made out of the excrement of defeated gods as well. But the point is clear. If you lived in those cultures, you believed there were many gods, they were extremely dangerous, that creation is the corpse of a loser god, and that human beings were the products of either the blood or excrement of other defeated gods. And they were nothing more than brute slaves of those very violent gods they feared. Talk about not having a good self-image. By contrast, the first chapter of Genesis challenges that pagan ancient Near Eastern worldview at every level. First, there's God. One thing abundantly clear in Genesis 1. There are not many gods. There is only one God. And he is the one who created everything. The sun, moon, stars were not gods. They were lights that the true God created. This is something we often just overlook. But this claim of monotheism was revolutionary in the ancient world. So simply put, one God, not many. What about creation? On top of that, the earth is not the corpse of a defeated serpent god. Genesis 1 states that the true God simply created it with his word, and when he created everything, he brought order out of chaos. On top of that, with everything he made, he declared it to be good. So creation is depicted as good, orderly, and brought about not because of some cosmic battle between gods, but by the wisdom and the word of the one true God. So simply put, creation is good and orderly, not a corpse left over from a chaotic battle. And then there's mankind. And what about human beings in Genesis 1? Are they made out of the blood or excrement of a defeated god to be mere slaves to the gods? No. Instead, Genesis 1 states that the true God made mankind in his image, and therefore human beings possess inherent worth and dignity. They are not created to be slavish brutes to immoral and terrifying gods, but rather to bear the likeness of the true Creator, God himself. So simply put, mankind is made in God's image. So there you have it. One God, good creation, mankind created in God's image. In the very first chapter of the Bible, these three themes aimed to blow apart the ancient Near Eastern worldview about reality. It was a true revolution in worldview. And it is something most people miss entirely because they are trying to interpret Genesis 1 through the modern lens of history and science. Genesis 1 through 11 and the subversion of ancient Near Eastern mythology. Now, I wanted to use that example from Genesis 1 to help articulate what I mean when I say that Genesis 1 through 11 is mythological literature. To recognize it as such is not to denigrate it, but rather to recognize it for the revolutionary work of genius that it is. Simply put, Genesis 1 through 11 starts by looking a lot like other ancient Near Eastern mythological literature, in that it uses the literary genre people in the ancient Near East would have been familiar with when talking about their worldviews and beliefs. But what Genesis 1 ends up doing is subverting that very ancient Near Eastern worldview. And in contrast, revealing a radically different vision of God, creation, and mankind. And part of that radically different vision is the teaching that mankind is made in God's image, and therefore has inherent dignity and worth. And therefore, because human beings have inherent dignity and worth, that means that human history is worth telling. And so, very subtly in the course of those 11 chapters, Genesis 1 through 11 takes the reader from that world of myth and proceeds to set the stage, so to speak, for something that had never been done before, the telling of human history. Beginning in Genesis 12, we are ushered into that human history, namely the life of Abraham and his descendants. And from that point on, the Bible bears witness to the fact that the one Creator God has entered into a covenant with humanity within history. That history is played out on the stage that Genesis 1 through 11 has constructed regarding the nature of God, creation, and humanity itself. But we must realize that the stage is not the same thing as the play. And we must remember that in order to get to the writing of history, there has to be some sort of bridge from the writing of myth to the writing of history. I believe Genesis 1 through 11 serves that purpose. And to be clear, Genesis 1 through 11 is certainly narrative, but it's not historical narrative. It's not giving historical details. It's addressing and subverting the ancient Near Eastern myths of that time by using that genre to teach the truth about God, creation, and mankind. Setting the stage, the literary structure of Genesis 1 through 11. Now, Genesis 1 through 11 gives us the fundamental biblical worldview lens through which we are to view God's involvement in human history. If it provides the stage and backdrop for the telling of God's involvement in human history, it is best that we understand how that stage is constructed by looking at the literary structure of Genesis 1 through 11. And if you want to understand Genesis 6 through 9, you have to understand its place within the larger literary structure of Genesis 1 through 11. Now, the easiest way to do this is to give you a visual. I came up with this flow chart of Genesis 1 through 11 over 20 years ago in order to help my high school students get a better grasp of how Genesis 1 through 11 fits together. When seen in this way, it becomes clear that Genesis 1 through 11 really comes in two parts. A, Genesis 1:1 to 6:4, from the story of creation to the story of the Nephilim, and B, Genesis 6:5 to 11:9, from the story of the flood to the story of the Tower of Babel, with Genesis 11:10 through 32 serving as the genealogical link to the story of Abraham. Within Genesis 1 through 11, we find that the narrative movement of the first part, Genesis 1:1 to 6:4, is essentially repeated in the second part, Genesis 6:5 to 11:9. And the key theme that runs throughout it all is what I call the War of the Offspring. Essentially, the narrative flow looks like this. A, God creates a hospitable world out of the primordial waters of chaos. That's Genesis 1. B, God creates and then enters into a covenant with humanity as rulers of his creation. That's Genesis 2. C, when humanity sins, God immediately declares war on the serpent's offspring and promises to defeat the serpent's offspring through the woman's offspring. That's Genesis 3. D, this war is fought within humanity itself and can be seen in the first two offspring of Adam and Eve. That's Cain and Abel. By virtue of killing Abel, Cain shows himself to be the serpent's offspring, and thus is banished. We are then told of his genealogy, the offspring of the serpent. That's Genesis 4. E. By contrast, Seth replaces Abel, and we are told of his genealogy, the offspring of the woman. That's Genesis 5. F. By Genesis 6:1 through 4, we find that evil and violence has corrupted God's good creation, and instead of representing God's good character to his creation, as image bearers were created to do, humanity has denigrated into becoming the exact opposite of what God intended. Therefore, God decides to wipe the slate clean, so to speak, and allow the primordial waters of chaos of Genesis 1:1 to flood over his creation, and thus take things back to the beginning and start over. Hence, the actual flood story is a decreation story. And once that is done, God gets back to work reestablishing his creation through Noah. That decreation story is obviously Genesis 6 and 7. So, now we begin with part 2. A. God creates a hospitable world out of floodwaters and brings about a recreation. Genesis 8. B. God brings out Noah and his family from the ark and enters into a covenant with Noah and all his offspring after him. God blesses Noah, just like Adam. God commands Noah to be fruitful and multiply, just like Adam. God articulates for Noah what they are allowed to eat, just like Adam. And God also gives a prohibition to Noah and his family, just like Adam. Noah thus is essentially Adam 2.0. God also promises never to destroy the earth with the floodwaters again. That's Genesis 9:1 through 17. And finally, there is the reiteration that human beings are made in God's image. The point of 9:1 through 17 is quite clear. God establishes covenant with Noah, his offspring, and all flesh, and he promises never again to destroy the earth with a flood. C. Yet, when Noah gets drunk and exposes his nakedness in his tent, just like Adam and Eve realized they were naked after they sinned, we find Ham looks upon his father's nakedness while Shem and Japheth, I can never say that name, cover their father's nakedness. The war of the offspring is still being played out within humanity, within Noah's own family. That's Genesis 9:18 to 29. D. The offspring of the serpent is thus depicted in the genealogy of Ham. And within Ham's line, we find all the bad nations and peoples that crop up in the Old Testament. That's Genesis 10:6 through 20. E. By contrast, the offspring of the woman is depicted in the genealogies of Japheth, Genesis 10:1 through 5, and more importantly, Shem, Genesis 10:21 and 32. F. By Genesis 11:1 through 9, we find once again that humanity is corrupting God's purposes for his creation. There are a number of literary connections between this passage and Genesis 6:1 through 4, such as the Nephilim are literally described in the Hebrew as men for a name, and the people of Babel wanted to make a name for themselves. That's a side note. So, of course, since God had promised never to destroy the world through a flood again, the key question at the end of Genesis 11 becomes, how will God deal with sin now? If the flood didn't wipe out the serpent's offspring, what will God do next? The answer comes through the offspring of Shem, for it is in his genealogy that we find the children of Eber, the Hebrews. It is through them, the offspring of the woman, that we get to Abraham. And so what we see in the course of Genesis 1 through 11 is this. Genesis 1 through 2 emphasize there is only one God, that his creation is very good, and that human beings are made in God's image. Yet in Genesis 3, it also states that despite being made in God's image, human beings sin and are in bondage to death. Nevertheless, God promises that he will work through humanity to eventually defeat sin and death, and thus redeem not only humanity, but also creation itself. The rest of Genesis 4 through 11 is thus the bridge that takes its ancient audience from the realm of myth to the doorstep of God's actions within human history. And one of those key pieces in the construction of that bridge is the way in which the writer of Genesis 1 through 11 reworks the ancient Near Eastern myths of Atrahasis and Gilgamesh to fit within the Hebrew worldview. Genesis 6 through 9, Noah's flood, Atrahasis, and Gilgamesh. Compared to everyone else in Genesis 1 through 11, Noah gets the most ink by far. The story of Noah's flood takes up the rest of chapter 6, as well as the entirety of Genesis 7 through 8. And then he even gets another chapter after the flood is over, in Genesis 9. Now, the interesting thing about the story of Noah and the flood is that other cultures in the ancient Near East also had similar stories. The two most famous ones are Atrahasis and Gilgamesh, both which probably date to the 17th century BC. Now, the thing to remember is that these flood stories were well known in the ancient Near East. Many like to speculate that the very reason why so many cultures have flood stories must be because at one point in history there was actually, in fact, a worldwide flood. Others speculate that the origin of the stories could have been a local flood throughout the ancient Near East. For our purposes, though, we simply have to say, okay, maybe. Put that to the side for now and move on. Our task is not to try to figure out how the stories came into existence, but rather how they were used by the various cultures of the ancient Near East. Or to put it another way, what is the point of the stories and what are they trying to teach? Also, it is important to know that most scholars agree that the Noah story dates as late as the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BC. Even if we say Moses himself wrote it, that still places the writing of the story later than either Atrahasis or Gilgamesh. And thus, it is not hard to conclude that the writer of the Noah story borrowed from the earlier sources. In fact, if one puts the Noah story and Gilgamesh side by side, the similarities are impossible to be just coincidence. Consider these. There are similar directions for the building of a boat. There are similar dimensions of the boat. In both stories, one family and all the animals come into the boat. In both stories, there is a cataclysmic deluge that covers the entire earth. In both stories, everything on the earth dies. In both stories, the boat ends up resting on a mountain. In both stories, birds are sent out to look for land. In both stories, a sacrifice is offered once the people are back on dry land. And in both stories, there is a sign in the sky. Ishtar lifts her necklace, and then in the Noah story, God puts his bow in the clouds. The point should be clear. The Epic of Gilgamesh contains a flood story that is really similar to the Noah story in Genesis 6 through 9. Therefore, since everyone labels Gilgamesh as an ancient Near Eastern myth, and since the Noah story is a lot like that, I believe it is proper to say that the Noah story fits into the same genre as Gilgamesh. That being said, though, I would also say that Gilgamesh is not true, but the Noah story is true. Not because Gilgamesh got its facts wrong and the Noah story got them right, but because what Gilgamesh was teaching about the gods and mankind was wrong, whereas what the Noah story was teaching was right. To understand what I mean by that, we need to look at the places in the two stories where there are significant differences. First, in Gilgamesh, the reason why the gods send the flood is because human beings were being too loud, and the gods were unable to get any sleep. By contrast, the reason why God sends the flood in Genesis 6 is because the wickedness of mankind was too great. Secondly, in Gilgamesh, we are told that the gods of Mesopotamia were terrified of the flood. So they flee to the upper reaches of heavens where the god Anu has his abode. Before they enter, we are told that they crouch and cower like dogs. By contrast, in the Noah story, the God of Israel is in complete control of all of nature. He has the power to turn the faucet on, and he has the power to turn it off. He is the creator God, and he is not afraid. These two differences mean everything. Now, what I want to emphasize is how easy it is for us in the modern world to miss the point of the Noah story. For the most part, people are unaware of Atrahasis and Gilgamesh. Consequently, we in the modern world read the story of Noah, and because of our ignorance of the ancient Near Eastern culture, as well as our modern scientific Enlightenment worldview, we immediately ask historical and scientific questions like, is it possible for one man to build a boat like that? When did it happen? Is there any evidence of a worldwide flood? We thus assume that the validity of the Noah story depends on whether or not it could be historically or scientifically proven. But the ancient Near Eastern culture was not a scientific Enlightenment culture, and they would not have been asking those questions in the first place. Sure, it's very possible that the people assumed such a story really happened, way back when. But that simply wasn't the real point. The purpose of the stories was to teach that particular culture's worldview and beliefs about the gods and human beings. And if you were a pagan who grew up listening to either Atrahasis or Gilgamesh, there was one thing that was crystal clear when it came to the gods. They were petty and dangerous and kind of rather psychotic. Think about it. Think about it. Think back to when you were a kid and had a sleepover with your friends. You know, it's getting late, you should all be going to sleep, but you're having too much fun and you're getting a little loud. And then your parents break down your bedroom door and you see they are holding flamethrowers in their hands. They shout at the top of their lungs, "We told you pathetic leeches to shut up!" And then they proceed to torch your entire room. And then, in the middle of the sleepover turned barbecue, your mom starts screaming, "Oh no, not the curtains! I didn't think what the smoke damage was going to do to the living room!" And then she hightails it out of there to call Service Master, while your dad just burns the whole place down, killing all your friends. And then, once everything stops smoldering, your parents turn to you and say, "Now clean this mess up, and don't you ever disobey us again." Well, I'm guessing that you wouldn't have too high of an opinion of your parents. Of course, you wouldn't say anything. You'd pick up that shovel and start digging a mass grave for your friends in the backyard, because if you didn't, you'd be killed too. Now, why such a morbid analogy? Well, that is kind of what the flood stories in Atrahasis and Gilgamesh are teaching about the gods. Human beings are worthless slaves, and if they get too loud, the gods will commit mass genocide. What you gonna do? Now, by contrast, the Noah story is strikingly different. The reason for the flood is not petty gods getting angry that their pathetic slave labor is enjoying themselves too much and getting too loud so that the gods can't get their beauty sleep, and then freaking out because things got out of hand. No, the reason for the flood in Genesis is that humanity had become exceedingly sinful and evil. And God is a God of justice who punishes evil because he is concerned with goodness and morality and has promised to do away with evil. If he didn't, he wouldn't be good. He wouldn't be righteous. He wouldn't be just. Incidentally, if you come back with something like, well, how is God just if he wipes out all humanity, including women and innocent children in a flood? That doesn't sound too just to me. Well, if you think that, you're missing the point still, and are still just reading it as if it were a literal historical account. Think of some story or movie where the main stronghold of the bad guys is blown up by the hero. Heck, think of Starkiller Base from The Force Awakens. Sure, those members of the First Order were pretty bad guys, but don't you think many of them were married with wives and children, probably living on the Starkiller Base planet? Well, then I guess Han Solo probably deserved to die then. And Rey, Finn, Poe, clearly they're not heroes. Anonymous people never mentioned in the story died. Well, of course no one says that, because we realize that Star Wars is science fiction and not literal history. Similarly, if we realize that the story of Noah's flood isn't purporting to be literal history, we can learn from it what it is clearly teaching about the character, righteousness, and power of the true God, and not treat it like it's a historical mass genocide. Conclusion. So let me conclude in a similar fashion to how I began. Yes, there are some really contentious debates surrounding not just the story of Noah's flood, but the entirety of Genesis 1 through 11. And yes, I fully understand the term myth is a highly loaded word that 9 times out of 10 is misused and misunderstood, and that makes things really hard. Yet the thing is that if you are going to understand any kind of writing, or movie, or TV show for that matter, you are going to have some kind of idea of its genre so that you can then assess it according to the literary norms and expectations of that genre. And if you interpret something according to the wrong genre, nothing is going to make sense. It would be like interpreting the nightly news as if it were a sitcom. And the cold hard fact is that the story of Noah's flood in Genesis 6 through 9 is really, really like the story of Gilgamesh. And everyone concludes that Gilgamesh is an example of ancient Near Eastern mythology. Therefore, if Genesis 6 through 9 is similar to Gilgamesh, and Gilgamesh is considered to be the genre of myth, what should we logically conclude about Genesis 6 through 9? Now, if you don't like the word myth, fine. But when it comes to genre, whatever you call Gilgamesh, you really should also call the story of Noah's flood, because the basic story is the same. Genesis 1 through 11 is crucial to understanding the rest of the historical biblical story, and is actually foundational to the gospel. But what makes it foundational isn't that it is accurate historical information. What makes it foundational is that it sets out the fundamental worldview through which we are able to make sense of the entire biblical story. Like I said earlier, it sets the stage for biblical history, but the stage is not the play itself. And with that said, let me just list the main points I want you to take away from this initial presentation. Number one, properly understood, myth is not a pejorative that says something isn't true. Properly understood, myth is a genre of ancient literature. And I believe that God can inspire His Word in any genre He so desires, be it history, prophecy, laws, parables, or whatever. He's the Creator God. He has the freedom to use creative means. 2. The ancient Near Eastern genre of myth was used to convey a culture's basic worldview and articulated their beliefs about ultimate purpose and meaning, particularly what they believed about the gods and human beings. Ancient Near Eastern myth was not attempting to do history or science. Number 3, the ancient Israelites were part of the ancient Near East, and thus used the same genre of myth to communicate their basic worldview and beliefs. But while they used that genre, they radically subverted the pagan ancient Near Eastern worldviews around them. 4, by insisting that human beings were created in God's image, Genesis 1:26 and 27 declared that human beings have inherent dignity and worth, and thus they introduced the very concept of history writing in the ancient world. More than any other culture in the ancient world, the Jews were obsessed with history. The justification for writing of their history came from the worldview stage they had constructed with the ancient Near Eastern genre of myth. Number 5, there is a clear literary structure to Genesis 1 through 11 that serves not only to articulate the basic worldview of ancient Israel, but also to take the reader from the world and genre of myth to the doorstep of history, beginning in Genesis 12 with Abraham. 6, at the very least, one needs to acknowledge that the story of Noah's flood in Genesis 6 through 9 is an integral part to the clear literary structure of Genesis 1 through 11. In addition, one needs to acknowledge that Genesis 6 through 9 looks a lot like Gilgamesh. So whatever genre label you give Gilgamesh, the story of Noah should have the same label. Finally, when it comes to the question of whether or not Noah's flood was an actual historical event, for now, let's just say maybe. But I think it is ultimately irrelevant. It would be like asking, in the parable of the Good Samaritan, did Jesus know of an actual Samaritan who helped a Jew who had been beaten up? Well, maybe he did. Maybe he took that historical event and turned it into a parable. That's possible. But it doesn't change the fact that the parable of the Good Samaritan is a parable, and that Jesus told it to answer a question about who is one's neighbor whom one should love. Whether or not the parable has a historical basis is irrelevant to the situation Jesus was addressing. No one is going to say, oh, if that parable isn't historical, then it's not true, because we understand the genre of parables and that parables aren't trying to do history. Now, I submit the same principle holds with Genesis 1 through 11, and specifically the story of Noah's flood. Whether or not the story is rooted in actual history, that doesn't change the fact that the story comes to us in the genre package of ancient Near Eastern myth. And like I said, I'm okay with that. God has the right to use whatever literary genre he chooses. If the story of Noah's flood is rooted in history, if there really was a worldwide flood 4,000 years ago, then we should find evidence of it in modern scientific disciplines like geology, biology, paleontology, and genetics. I'll let my fellow debaters make the case for that.